as a lot of you know, I was in marketing before I got into preaching, and went to seminars and heard a lot of really interesting talks and really interesting discussions. And there's one that I guess has always kind of stuck with me. The presentation was about the power of storytelling. And they started with the premise that it is possible to put a monetary value on what a story is worth. And the point was that what they did, these two journalists basically went out and they started buying a bunch of odd things at flea markets and thrift shops and all these kind of things. Just novelty pins, snow globes, lost keys, just things of no particular value. The average cost of each of these was $1.29. I know. And in less than a year, they had sold all these items on eBay for $3,612.51. Now, how did they do that? And of course, that's, the number is the thing that jumps out. But the point of this was that what they were able to do is that they went and took each of these items and they got a professional writer. And that writer wrote a brief background story about each of those items, whatever it might have been. Sometimes it was just something that would describe the sentimental value of that story, of that item. Sometimes just create something really interesting that went along with it. And as a result of that, the increased perceived value of that particular item went well beyond what it was actually worth. And the point that they were trying to make is that story matters. Stories are powerful. They directly impact the perceived value of whatever it is that we're dealing with. Because they engage our attention, they engage our interest, they just become a lot more interesting to us. In fact, I think there's a scientific study that said that when we're involved in and engaged in a story, our neural activities actually increase fivefold. And we become engaged when we tell stories or when we listen to stories. If we're people that actually listen to stories, sometimes we zone out. But when we listen, it engages us. And so I think it's understandable why the parables of Jesus was so powerful and compelling. And particularly, I know when you guys teach the kids, I suspect that parables are a pretty useful tool in that, because they get that. It's hard enough for me to explain some kind of nebulous concepts like love and kindness and without having something concrete to explain it with. But when I go to the Good Samaritan, I can show you what love looks like. What does it mean to love your neighbor? Well, this is what it looks like. And instinctively, our brain starts to kick in. We listen to that. We remember it. And we start to not only think about that, but we start to see, well, there's some other instances where that connects with me, where I can see some concrete examples of that, because visuals and understanding in that regard are helpful for us in grasping these messages. But you know what made Jesus' parable unique, and that's where we get into the lesson in Matthew chapter 4, is that the format of parables is a great teaching tool, but it's also something that, when crafted in a specific way, allows for a pretty good bit of ambiguity. I've heard a lot of times that the parables were intended not only to reveal, but also to conceal. And there's a lot of truth to that. And when Jesus talks about the parables, it's interesting that he has this discussion in Mark, and Mark introduces the parables for the first time. We talked about this in class last year. Mark doesn't use very many parables. And so he makes sure to explain at the very beginning in Mark 4, the first time he brings them in, what exactly they are and what they're intended to accomplish. And what we find is that a parable is intended to have an impact really based a lot of times on my own heart and my own approach and my own mindset going into a parable. Am I going to go in with a determination that I want to understand what Jesus is talking about here? Or am I going to go in deciding that I want to find something that's going to fit my own ideas of what's true? Or do I just kind of want to hear an interesting story? I suspect a lot of times that's what happened with Jesus and a lot of the people that listen to him. Man, he tells a great story. And so we have the Sermon on the Mount, and we have other stories where these people would come to Jesus, and when they would listen to him, and they would walk away saying, nobody's ever spoken like this. And yet Jesus would always go back to those people in the next round and ask, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say? He described the idea that you think of me as a piper, you dance to the music, and we enjoy that, and we think it's great to listen, and we love that you heal your sick, but we're not really digesting what it is you said. And the problem is not with the format of parables, it's the problem with the human heart. And so when Jesus has given the first parable in Mark 4, the parable of the sower, we read him talking with his disciples in verse 10. It says, when he was alone with them, the 12 asked him about the parables, and he said to them, to you has been given the secrets of the kingdom of God, but for these outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see, but not perceive, and may indeed hear, but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. And he said to them, do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? Now, there's three implications from this passage, from the statement that he just made. And they should be pretty obvious, I think. First of all, the obvious one is that parables are intended to reveal spiritual mysteries, mysteries about the kingdom of God. If we want to understand material concepts, if we understand how to get ahead of business, if we want to understand how to live a life that is more physically, material, fulfilling, parables are not there for that purpose. They are intended to instruct about the kingdom of God. So I'm going to be looking, whenever I look at a parable, about a specific type of application. It's going to be one that's spiritual. Now, second of all, is that parables, kind of like we've talked about, are not understood by those who do not want to understand. Parables, and this is a pattern we see throughout the Bible. It's one of the things where we think about parables, we think about Jesus immediately. But as we've been reading through the Old Testament, I suspect you all, if you didn't already notice it, you've noticed it already, that parables have been around for a long time. Jesus wasn't the first one to start doing them. We see them on a number of occasions in the Old Testament used in different contexts and with different levels of effect. The one that jumps out maybe the most, to me at least, is the story of David and Nathan. When Nathan goes to David after David has sinned with Bathsheba and he has put Uriah the Hittite to death, and rather than just walking into the throne room and accusing David and pointing his finger and said, you've done this, he does something very different. He goes to him with a parable. He tells him about the man who had a single sheep, and he loved it and cared for it. And then the rich man comes and offers a feast, and rather than using from his own, he takes the one that belongs to this other person. And we see the impact that it has on David, because David's heart is conducive to the message. Because David hears this, he understands it, and he understands the implications, and they resonate with him. So that when David hears the message, you are the man, this is you, he can't avoid the implication. He has to now apply it to himself. He has to look at that story objectively and empathize with the main character, and then he realizes that he's talking about it. It resonates with him, and it's powerful, and it causes him to make a change. But that's not always how it works. Because if you remember another example from our Ezekiel class last year in Ezekiel chapter 24, you may remember the story of God sending Ezekiel to the people with a parable. And in Ezekiel chapter 24, verses 3 through 5, he tells them, utter a parable to the rebellious house and say to them, thus says the Lord God, set on the pot, set it on, pour water also, put in the pieces of meat, all the good pieces, the thigh and the shoulder, fill it with choice bones. Take the choicest one of the flock, pile the logs under it, boil it well, seethe also its bones in it. He's describing the state of Jerusalem. He talks about the idea that Jerusalem is about to be put under siege, and they're going to be surrounded, and they're going to be trapped in the city, and they need to repent and turn to God, and to avoid the inevitable of what's going to happen if they remain in that pot for too long. But you notice earlier in this passage, that same proverb is being used by a lot of the prophets and a lot of the teachers in Israel, but for a very different reason, in a very different application. Because in chapter 11 and verse 2, God says, he said to me, son of man, these are the men who devise iniquity, and who give wicked counsel in the city, who say the time is not near to build houses. This city is the cauldron, and we are the meat. So they're using the exact same parable. And it may very well be that this is taking place after Ezekiel has already given them this parable. And they've now gone in and twisted it around and said, well, you know what? Here's what it really means. See, we're the choice meat. The cauldron is what's keeping us from falling into the fire. As long as we stay in the city, we're going to not only be protected, but God is going to transform us into something wonderful. We're going to be this really great, delicious soup. That's how we choose to interpret that, because that's what they wanted to do. And so this idea that when we use parables, and when Jesus uses parables, there's an opportunity. If I take that parable and I go in with an idea of how I want to understand it, I can pretty much apply that message however I want to apply it, right? And if my heart's not right, I'm going to probably apply it in a way that is favorable to me, that kind of makes me feel good. It agrees with what I already believe. And so, in that way, the parable becomes a very effective tool, not just in teaching, but also in revealing the state of my heart. Am I willing to listen to what God has to say? Now there's a third implication. Because when Jesus, if you remember at the very end of this, the last thing he says in this before he goes into the explanation of the parable of the sower, he says, do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? And that's kind of an interesting statement, because there's an implication, at least from what I can see, is that Jesus expected that the disciples would hear this parable and understand it. That they wouldn't necessarily need it to be clarified. They could listen to that and go, oh yeah, I know exactly what he's talking about. But they didn't. And the point of that, I think, is that parables, by implication, are not intended to be something brand new that I've never heard before, that there's no context to it at all. There's something in this that I ought to understand if I have a mature and strong understanding of God and his word in all the context that's surrounding this story. Jesus is indicating you should have been able to figure out what I'm talking about. Now, he doesn't mean that because the apostles were particularly smart, although some of them probably were, because they could put together all the pieces themselves. Jesus has only given us a couple of clues, but if I think about it hard enough, I can figure out the puzzle and solve the mystery that has been before me. It's not because there's only one possible reasonable application of the story. We can go to the Sower and probably come up with all kinds of ideas about how it might be applied apart from Jesus' explanation. It's because just like all the parables, they are set in context. A context of Jesus' teaching, a context of the discussions that have been going on surrounding the parable itself. And an honest person who desires to know what Jesus is trying to teach is going to ask the questions, what is it that Jesus is trying to get me to understand of this? And if I don't understand, where am I going to go to figure it out? Well, the apostles, to their credit, they don't go huddle up in a corner like the Pharisees often would do when Jesus asked them a difficult question and say, okay, how are we going to figure this out? They go to Jesus and say, Jesus, explain this parable to us. We don't understand. And that's how the Word of God, obviously we can't ask Jesus directly now, but we understand that the Word of God ought to be a clarifying influence on all of the parables, so that when I look at a parable, I'm not just looking at it in a vacuum. I'm looking at it in the context of everything else that's been taught. And so, as we see this, that we can obviously see the power of the parables, but we can also see some dangers there already, right? And we have to understand that we need to be very careful about how we interpret and how we use parables. I'm sorry, I meant to look through these. They are intended to be interpreted with a right mental and spiritual approach. And if I don't do that, if I don't have that right approach, there is a danger of misusing these parables. And so that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit. How is it that we are to go about interpreting parables? And full disclosure, I started this lesson talking about, because I wanted to talk about a particular parable that had come to my mind and had some discussion about it. It's one that can be kind of tricky at times. And as I started preparing for it, I started laying the groundwork, and I realized I was basically doing an entirely different sermon. And rather than keeping us here for an hour and a half, I'm going to break that out. So I want us to think this way about some things that I suspect we all know, but maybe we haven't thought about them in the context of a set of rules or guidelines or I don't know how you would describe it. How exactly is it that we need to go in and systematically look at it? And I think one of the things is I was thinking about this story, and obviously when you're going to tell a story about a parable, you start thinking about parables in your own life. And I started thinking about how we often listen to stories and how we talk to each other. And the first thing that came to my mind is, if you've ever been in a situation where you tell somebody a story, and you tell them because you want to, and the person just doesn't, what they get out of that is completely different from what you intended. How does that make you feel? You're kind of like, you're not really listening to me. That's not where I'm going with this. For example, let's say that I have a friend who has lost his wallet, can't find it. He's given up. He's ready to call the bank. He says, I just don't know what to do. I've looked everywhere. I've looked carefully. I'm just going to have to get a new license. I'm going to cancel my credit. And by the way, this is a purely hypothetical situation. It is not intended to reflect anybody that you might know, including me. But the same. But let's say that a friend of mine is in this situation. So I say, you know what? I got a story for you. I want you to listen to this. There was a time that I went to a restaurant to pick up ticket. All right? Hypothetical. And I went in with my wallet in my hand. At the last minute, I decided to pay by phone. As a result of that, I've got my food, I've got my phone, I've got my wallet all together, and I'm not really paying a lot of attention to that. And so I go home, and within a day or so, I realized that I can't find my wallet. And I did exactly what you did. I looked everywhere. I looked in every conceivable place that it might be. I retraced my steps when I went in that night because I remembered that was the last time I had it. And I remembered that I had it in my hand, so I thought, well, maybe I dropped it. I even went back to the restaurant and looked on the ground to see if maybe it was still there. And it was nowhere. And I was exactly where you are right now. And then I went back into my bedroom and I looked in the same place that I've looked 40 times already today. And there it was. It was kind of concealed a little bit by the shadow, but it was sitting right there on the top of my nightstand, slightly in the shadow because it's a dark wallet and it kind of blends in with the shadow and with the wood grain. And so it's kind of hard to see. And so he looks at it and he goes, oh, okay, I get it. So what you're saying is that I need to buy a wallet that's light colored or maybe paint a yellow strip on it so that when I lose it, I can see it more. No. Again, we started thinking, well, that might be a great idea, and it might have helped in this situation, but that's not the point. The point is don't quit looking. The point is that you probably didn't search nearly as carefully as you think you did. And if you'll go back, calm down, and look carefully, and maybe turn on the lights, you're going to see what you find, because it's here somewhere. You ever tell a story like that? And you realize that it's just not going over because somebody's they've picked out something in that story that they've latched onto that matters to them. And they're not paying attention to what matters to you. And that's the problem, I think, a lot of times that we have with parables. The idea that when we look at parables, the first thing that we need to be thinking about is what is Jesus' intent? I need to figure out what exactly it is that he wants to bring out of this story. Because it's one thing for me to miss an anecdote that somebody else tells. That's fine. But when I miss the point of Scripture, when I start drawing parallels or parables, meanings out of parables that are my own invention, beyond what Jesus has tried to tell me, what have I actually done? Well, this is where I think we sometimes get ourselves in trouble when we read the parables. And I'm sure you probably heard this, and I've heard this as well. We're very careful as members of the Lord's church. We go to Revelation 22:18, and we understand that if anyone takes from the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away his share of the tree of life. If anyone adds to them, God will add to the plagues. So we take that seriously. I at least hope we do. And so when we go to Revelation, we don't just start throwing around wild theories. Sometimes we do, but we know that we're not supposed to. We need to be very careful that we're representing that book in a way that is in line with Jesus' intention in revealing it to us. And we rightly apply that to the rest of Scripture because we understand that there's a meaning that God has intended for it and that I don't have any business injecting my own ideas or my own opinions. I need to go, as we talk about it in 1 Corinthians 4:6, not to go beyond the written word. We know that's an important thing for us. We know that we ought not, as Matthew 15:9 says, to teach the doctrine the precepts of men. I shouldn't be injecting my own ideas to the extent that I'm now pushing aside the things that God has taught himself. The idea of staying with the traditions and the teachings of the apostles, as 2 Thessalonians 2:15 talks about, not adding our own ideas. But then we get to the parables. And I think our instinct to interpret starts to kick in. Because these are stories that are designed, I think, to insert us into the action. So they make us think about things and they make us consider through our own eyes, but the same thing that makes it powerful for us is also the thing that seems to embolden us sometimes so that we start kind of finding all kinds of meanings. I can go into a parable and dissect it and pull out all kinds of things, and I can start assigning symbols and meanings, and I start coming up with all kinds of ideas of what this parable might also mean. Well, what have I just done? Well, isn't that adding to God's word? Well, it is. We don't think about it in that way because, again, we think about parables as things that we sometimes can interpret. So it's easy for us to kind of fall into that trap of interpreting parables rather than studying them for what they are and limiting myself to what is it that Jesus is trying to teach us, as opposed to going in and finding every little grain of nugget of truth that I can find in this parable that I can apply it. And I think the reason that we fall into that is because that's how we study it. We go to the Sermon on the Mount, we go verse by verse, and that's an appropriate thing to do, because everything that Jesus says in that sermon is intended to be something that is taught and something that we can understand and that we can dig into. And it's amazing, as we talked about when we studied this or did lessons on this earlier, that we can go into that every single time, and it seems like we find something new. There's a richness about God's word. There's a discovery, and we talked last week about the story of David and Mephibosheth. It's not a parable, it's an actual historical event. But we went in there and we start to see how many of the different aspects of the story there are, how many examples of foreshadowing and character that are models for us and are there for us to understand and to grow from. That's what 1 Corinthians 10:6 says. Those are included for our learning. And so we attack them and we dissect them, and that's an appropriate thing to do. But parables don't work that way. That's not how parables are designed to be studied. Because when we think about parables, we think about any story that you want to talk about. Parables are intended to be the message. It's not composed of individual messages. The parable is the message. It's the thing that I'm designed to understand. I think we always understand that. In other contexts, I suspect that all of us at some point have heard of things like Aesop's Fables. You may have learned. I don't think they still teach those in school. I'm sure that's probably where I heard them. Maybe your parents taught you. Maybe you teach your kids that. We're all familiar with at least a handful of them, and we understand how they work. There's one more. There's a story that is told, and it's intended to get you to this one end spot. We all know the story of the hare and the tortoise. One more. We don't go into it and start analyzing every little component. We don't come out and say, well, there's a lot of messages in the hare and the tortoise. For example, we're not going to lose a race if we're not overconfident, we're going to win. In whatever race. Maybe napping in the middle of the day can come to nowhere. Maybe that's the message. Maybe the idea that turtles are smarter than rabbits. Okay, maybe that's a message. I can come up with all kinds of potential applications, but we don't do that. We understand very clearly that there is one intended message. Slow and steady wins the race. And whatever I derive out of it beyond that is kind of my own invention. And it's not the intention of the author. And there's a sense that we can do that on purpose. And I think we do that a lot with parables. We might go to the parable of the 10 virgins, for example, Matthew 25. And I suspect all of us at one point have heard this application. We're all familiar with the story. The 5 virgins who are foolish don't have extra oil, so when midnight comes and the bridegroom comes, and now they're out of oil, and they have to go to the 5 wise virgins and ask, hey, give us of your oil. And the wise virgins say, no, we can't give you because we won't have enough of our own. Have you ever heard anybody then say, and see, and that's a big message for us today, because we can't allow someone else's sin, someone else's negligence, or someone else's attitude to impact our salvation or our service to God. That's a valid point, but it's not the point of the parable. It's not what Jesus is trying to tell. Because we can go a lot of ways with that. We can start becoming very selfish in our attitude towards other people. If I start thinking about that as an attitude that Jesus is trying to foster here. Hey, that person's lost, but that's their problem. I got problems of my own. That's not the point of this parable. He says very clearly what it is. Watch the verse 13 to 25. For you know neither the day nor the hour. Everything in this parable is designed to get us to this point. and to get us to understand that message. Because parables typically have a single application. Now, I know that's not a universal belief. There are some people that will disagree with that. I strongly believe that this is the case. Now, you can find passages, I think, where, or parables where you can make an argument that there are lessons that kind of come out of the primary message. You know, we talk about the parable of the Sower as a pretty good example, I think, of the idea that, we can learn about the different types of soil, and there's a sense in which those are distinct messages within the parable, and that's fair. But for the most part, there is a very specific message. And what happens a lot of times is we'll go into a parable and we'll start trying to add layers of meaning where God has not added them and try to interpret something. We come up with something that sometimes can be harmless and sometimes can be okay in itself. But sometimes it can be pretty dangerous. And the one that I always think about, probably more than any of them, is in the parable of the weeds over in Matthew chapter 13. This is a passage that ought to be a pretty straightforward parable. But it's been misused in a lot of ways by people who have decided to read in their own ideas of what this parable means. If you remember the story in verse 24 of chapter 13, he says, he put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemies came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, do you not sow good seed in the field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, an enemy has done this. So the servant said to him, then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, no, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles and be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Now, if we stop there, without going on in the chapter and looking at not only the context, but also what Jesus is going to say about this parable later on, we can get in some trouble. And you may very well have heard people who will go to this and make the argument that, see, here's what's going on here. God's saying that there's going to be sinful people in the church, which is his kingdom, and there's going to be righteous people, and there's nothing we can do about it. And so we need to not worry about it and let God handle it. And therefore, if we've got somebody that's in sin in the Lord's church, well, God will deal with that. You need to just deal with your own thing. You ever heard that application? It's a pretty dangerous application and a misapplication of what's going on, because I bring in my own baggage and my own predetermined definition of this parable. Because I look at the idea that when he talks about the kingdom, well, because we've all been taught the kingdom and the church are the same exact thing, and therefore he's talking about gathering out of his church, and therefore there are going to be sinful people in the Lord's church right up until the day of judgment, and that's just the way it's going to be. And so we come away with that message. And there's a side point that comes out of that, by the way, which is that each parable is its own universe with its own defined symbols. I can't take a symbol or an element of one parable and use the definition over here and apply it over here. I can't assume that just because, for example, the kingdom in other passages may refer to the Lord's church, I can't necessarily say that that's what it means here, because this is a parable that exists on its own. It was created specifically for this purpose. And what we find, and for example, we see the idea of the master used in a number of different parables. Jesus often used a parable that deals with the master and servants. And I'm giving it this way. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to do a lesson on the unjust servant. And I think one of the things that gets us in trouble is we see the master described in this passage, and we just assume, well, the master in these other parables is talking about God, so therefore it must represent God here. But that's not the point. Each parable has its own definitions. And more often than not, Jesus will tell you what those definitions are if they're not apparent. And that's exactly what he does in this parable in Matthew 13 when he goes down in verse 37 and tells them exactly what this parable means. He says the field in verse 38 is the world. And the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one. And so he describes this idea that in the end of time, the angels are going to go out into God's kingdom, which is what? Which is the field. Which is what? Which is the world. So Jesus explains very clearly what it's talking about. And when we look at that context, when we put all these things together, we start to understand that what Jesus is trying to teach in this parable is pretty simple. What is it going to be like for you as apostles to go out into an unrighteous world and live righteously? You're going to be given the keys to the kingdom of heaven. You're going to go out and teach the word in the world. And as we've already seen in the parable of the sower, you're going to have some success and you're going to have some failure. And you're going to have some people that are going to do great for a while, but they're going to fade away over time. But if you'll just be patient, there's some here that are going to really understand and they're going to accept it and they're going to flourish and they're going to bring forth a lot of fruit. But you're going to go through this process and look around the world and say, well, if God has indeed set Jesus on the throne and if Jesus is reigning, why does it look like he's reigning? Why is there still evil? Why am I living in this world where sin seems to be all around us? And in fact, seems to be overwhelming the children of God. And his point is, don't worry about it. Because just because Jesus is on the throne and reigning, that doesn't mean evil is going to disappear from the world. But God sees it. And God is going to deal with it. And at the end, after this has happened, the righteous, he says, will shine like the sun. In other words, you're going to be justified if you're willing to be faithful. If you are willing to resist the evil that surrounds you. That's a pretty simple application. And what we find is, for the most part, when we start to look at the parables in the context in which they are intended, even when Jesus doesn't give us an explanation, it's going to be relatively easy for us to understand, at least in a relatively broad sense, what Jesus is trying to say. You know, there are some passages, some parables that I still kind of am a little unsure of. But I'm pretty sure I can get close. I can get close enough to understand the basic premise of what Jesus is trying to tell us. You know, there's a good example of context over Mark 7. It's actually a good way at one point I was going to try to talk about what a parable is and give all kinds of different examples. But this is actually a relatively good example of how parables are not always what we think of parables as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And there's a sense in which that's true. But that's a narrow definition. And if you go to Matthew 7:14, Jesus tells a parable that's a little bit different than what we would typically think of as a parable. I personally would not define it as a parable because we changed the definition of parable over time. He says in verse 14 that, hear me, all of you, and understand there's nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of the person are what defiles him. It says in verse 17, when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about that parable. Now, the word there is translated parable, but it's a word that simply means, if you understand the Greek word parabola, which means to place beside. If you did geometry or any of those other things, you know the idea of a parabola. It's the idea of placing two ideas together to make a comparison and to understand a lesson. And it might be a story, but it might also be simply a spiritual truth or a wise saying. That typical word, the Hebrew word mashal, is used in the Old Testament a lot of times for different things such as proverbs or parables as we would think of it today. But the idea, again, is that what he's talking about here is a parable. And he's trying to give them an example of something spiritual by giving them a physical explanation. And so when he goes in and talks about this idea of what exactly it is that defiles a person, you know, when we look at this, it'd be very easy, and I've heard people make the argument, again, if I want to take this out of context and ignore the context of what's being discussed, I've heard this parable used as an argument that says, look, the things that you do are not what defile you. You know, the external things, I can take anything into my body, drugs, alcohol, whatever it might be. I can engage in all kinds of different things, but that's not what makes me impure. What makes me impure is my attitude. So as long as my heart is good, those external things don't matter. Have you ever heard that argument? And hopefully you haven't. But it is a very prominent argument for a lot of people, particularly in the LGBT community, that will make the argument, see, anything that goes into me, that doesn't matter. That doesn't make me. But the idea, and again, Jesus explains exactly what he's talking about. He says, from within, out of the hearts of man come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness. All these things come from within, he says, and they defile a person. What does he mean by that? Well, we understand from the context that what Jesus has been talking about is not the idea of something that is inherently impure. We go back to the beginning of chapter 1. This whole discussion is talking about the idea of eating with unwashed hands. The idea that when I eat something, but I haven't ceremoniously cleansed my hands, that is going to defile the meat, and it's therefore going to defile me when I eat it. And Jesus' point is that that's not how defilement works. And Mark inserts the comment in his account that he said this making all things pure, or making all foods clean. In other words, he shows you that there's nothing inherently criminal or sinful or unclean about eating meats that under the law of Moses were considered unclean. They become unclean because God said don't eat. But when that command is taken away, now it doesn't matter. That it doesn't change you. It doesn't affect you. And so, again, when we look at the context, it's pretty easy to understand what he's talking about. And that kind of leads into the final point, and that is that when we read this, when we come away with a conclusion like we just talked about, it ought to be relatively easy for us to then say, well, hold on a second. I understand the application you're making, but he never teaches that anywhere else. In fact, he teaches just the opposite over here. We have to take parables as being consistent with what has already been taught. Parables are not designed to create doctrine. I don't go to a doctrine, and we can sometimes, again, get into problems with this. And I think one of the reasons, for example, that we have trouble with parables like the rich man and Lazarus is that we go in and look at that and we try to interpret it as a story because, we say, well, the Bible doesn't call it a parable. Well, that's true, but the Bible doesn't call a lot of parables parables. The Bible doesn't always designate something. We have to learn from context and look at it and say, well, what exactly is Jesus doing here? Is he telling an actual account of something? Is he describing something that actually happened? We don't have that problem with the prodigal son. The prodigal son is not called a parable. The parable of the Good Samaritan is not called a parable. But we understand what they are because we see the context. And so when we look at these things, we understand that they're not intended to be a source for us to go in and figure something out that we can't understand from other parts of the Bible. They're not intended to give us new insight. What they're intended to do is to clarify the things that we ought to already understand. And when we approach parables like that, it becomes much easier, I think, to keep ourselves focused on what we need to be thinking about in terms of how we read these parables. Parables aren't intended to make things harder for us to understand. And I think that's one of the things that we have to remember as well. That they are intended to help us to understand something, if we have the right attitude. And it's interesting in Mark 4, down in verse 21, where he's talking to the disciples and the apostles. He's telling them to be careful how they're listening and that they need to understand what's being taught. And he says, is the lamp brought in to be put under a basket, under a bed, and not on the stand? For nothing is hidden except to be made manifest, nor is anything secret except to come to light. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. I think the point he's trying to make is pretty simple there. You're going to need to teach these things, and they're not intended to be kept a secret. You need to be able to clearly and plainly teach these things that have been revealed to you in parables. I find it interesting that we don't see any recordings of the apostles teaching in parables. Maybe they did. But it's interesting that once Jesus is ascended and once the kingdom is established, and once, as Paul talks about the idea of the veil being lifted, parables seem to go away, don't they? And again, I don't know if maybe that's coincidence. Maybe it's just they did it all the time and the Bible just doesn't tell us that. But I just find that interesting. Parables are intended, again, to reveal and conceal. But if we have the right heart, we're going to understand what God has to say. And, in Matthew 13, the final thing that Jesus asked them as he wraps this discussion up, I always find it kind of interesting that he uses a parable to sum up the parables and their ability to understand the parables. He asked them in verse 51, have you understood all these things? And they said to him, yes. He said to them, therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of its treasures what is new and what is old. Now, this is actually, I talked about one of some of the parables that are a little bit trickier to understand. And this is one that I think has a little bit of ambiguity about it. But I think it's a safe ambiguity. Again, when we do the things that we talked about and keep it in context and look at what is taught in other aspects, I think we can pull together a pretty good idea of what Jesus is trying to say to the disciples. I think what he's saying is simply this. If you can understand these concepts about the kingdom that we have discussed in these other parables, you are going to be an effective teacher. The apostles were not scholars. They were not scribes. They were not anyone that would be respected for their knowledge of the law. He says, you can be as effective as any scribe if you understand the teachings that Jesus has given you to teach. The idea, he talks about things that are old and things that are new. There's some things that you're going to have to teach people that have been around since the beginning. But Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, he takes them back to the principles that have always been in place for God's people. This isn't anything new. I think I made the argument at one point that I can go and take the Sermon on the Mount, and you can just about find every single principle that he mentions in the Old Testament somewhere. But at the same time, there's going to be new things. There's going to be the revealing of the kingdom, and the idea that this kingdom that you're going to be teaching is going to be very different than anything that anybody's seen before. But when you have a full and strong understanding of these concepts that Jesus has been trying to teach them, you're going to be as effective in dealing with them as any trained scribe. And I think that's kind of what he's trying to say. The gospel, Jesus uses simple stories, simple analogies to explain. And I think probably the only time that parables get us in trouble, I think, is when we try to make them harder than they are. To find meaning where there is no meaning, to find application where application was not intended. And again, it's hard. It's a hard habit to get out. I have to remind myself of this whenever I teach parables. Because I'll find myself saying, hey, that looks like an analogy right there, and that has a thing there, and I can come up with all kinds of ideas of what that would apply. But then we remind ourselves, well, why is it? What's the message that Jesus is trying to teach? Am I losing the point? Am I, as we talked about, have I lost the plot in my discussions of what this parable is supposed to mean? So the lesson is yours. Hopefully it's useful. Again, as we talk about some of the other parables, I'm going to try to apply this framework myself as we think about these things and try to understand and filter out our own ideas and our own preconceptions and just ask the question, what exactly is it Jesus trying to teach us? And then how can we apply that to our